Anyway, thank you, Laura, and it's absolutely lovely to be here this morning, not least because just to stand in front of these two Feibusch works of art is really something after a year and a half of being on Zoom and just looking at people's heads or faces. And that is also very timely for us for Feibusch because, of course, Feibusch is the master of the body and the feet. And so it's just wonderful to be able to see them as well. Yukon, can we have the first slide?
Yes.
I hope you can hear me. I'm going to raise my voice because there are some audibility issues. In February 2017, I moved to a hilly wooded part of southeast London, which is also a suburban area of post-World War II hastily built houses. One cold day, I walked into a brick-built church, for no particular reason, expecting little and assuming I would give the space no more than a second. I was surprised to see a mural above the altar, slide please, that to my eye was stunning. Here was Hans Feibusch's Ascension of Christ. In particular, I was struck by the vivid and colour palette, specifically a distinctive pink, perhaps to compete with the then recent 20th century invention of the neon. Sorry, the colours are a little bit muted on the screen here. The colours seem all the more striking against the range of human gestures and responses, facial expressions with some open-mouthed and bodily movements. You can also see some of these elements in this montage of details slide from St Alban the Martyr, Holborn. Stepping inside this church was the start of my journey of finding Feibusch and his religious murals in numerous London and Sussex churches. Indeed, he painted over 40 murals in the UK, and they deserve to be far better known than they are. I think he's also a neglected artist. What is also striking is that Feibusch was a German Jewish refugee who, despite his modernist artistic background, could adapt his art to paint large and monumental images to support the Christian liturgy. In an Anglican context too, when of course so many medieval Catholic churches that once contained such narrative and instructional murals were perhaps ironically destroyed at the Protestant Reformation. Out of kindness and compassion in putting aside his own faith, he offered to paint church walls once more, including for many a bombed-out church that he saw as he went about on the London Red Bus. He worked in spaces themselves brutal reminders through their destruction of the recent past. So we have a Jewish artist to thank for revitalising this lost painting tradition. Who knows what would have happened to his modernist European reputation if he had stayed in a Germany free of Nazis? But imagine he comes to Britain to paint what he calls sublime visions for really many a derelict, desecrated church. So who was Hans Feibusch? Born in Frankfurt in 1898 to a dental surgeon father, an amateur artist mother, Feibusch was posted to the Russian front in 1916 to 18. He then trained as an artist, first in Germany, in Berlin from 1918, where he studied under the German Expressionists, followed by a scholarship to study Italian art in 1921, where he particularly admired the work of Italian fresco painters. And then a short spell in Paris. He came to Britain in 1933 with his wife Sidonie, sensing what was to come if he had stayed in Germany. His work was then included in the brutally named Degenerate Art Exhibition in 1937 in Munich, and I do have the catalogue for this here. It showed the work, next slide please, of cutting-edge art. Work, though, which the Nazis thought was barbaric and crude. There were avant-garde images of the human body, jarred, even brutal, disjointed figure, showing a descent from the classical legacy of the ideal form that, of course, the Nazis favoured. There were also sculpted figures showing the influence of African art and haunted expressions that, in the context of painters like Feibusch, we might now see as a presage of what was to come. In England, Feibusch was a London ambulance driver during the war, and he never returned to live in his native land. Slide. But he was to become a well-established and prolific painter of people and portraits. I'm not sure if this is working, but you can see here this emphasis on the human body with all its shapes and many manifestations. The still life slide. Very much working in the late 19th century European tradition of the still life. Slide. And landscape from places in England, but also far away in Europe, such as Taormina. You'll also see his very expressive way with paint, these trees. He also became a commercial artist, designing posters for companies like Shell to complement his fine art. And he painted prolifically between 1938 to 70. So what you see here is a truly modern painter with a free expression with form, colour, and the love of the body, which was also developed in his non-religious art, but which somehow works very well in the Christian setting as well, as we can see face to face. This must be one of the reasons why his work needs to be celebrated. I might even go as far as saying no previous painter of religious subjects expressed emotion and suffering like he did. While England in the 1930s did not possess the artistic innovative edge of places like Berlin, Munich and Paris, he seemed to be able to adapt his strong artistic aesthetic onto the cold, damp walls of English churches. While Feibusch's obituaries slide mention the mural he did at St Alban the Martyr, as well as in Goring-on-Sea and Chichester, no others are mentioned. And so the selection I've chosen to speak about today are not that well known. Few tubes connect us to these churches, and I'm thinking of writing to Transport for London to suggest that they put it on just for Feibusch churches. But at the moment it is trains, buses and feet, which of course is very appropriate with Feibusch's love of feet, and they are worth it. He was baptised into the Church of England in 1965, but in 1992 formally left the Christian faith. He got to know Kenneth Clarke, then director of the National Gallery, and Bishop Bell of Chichester, a great advocate of bringing back the church mural after centuries without them. Slide. Other important acquaintances included Thomas Ford, the architect of many 1950s churches, and a small group of artists and writers such as Henry Moore and T.S. Eliot, who met at the Bishop's Palace in Chichester to discuss the role of the church and the artist. And you'll see there his characteristic signature, which he does often put beside people's feet. Next slide, please. And here he is, painting his murals. You'll see him here in his overalls, and he's discussing one with one of his assistants, a woman called Phyllis Bray, who was also an artist in her own right. Slide, please. This is just a little excerpt from his wonderful book on mural painting, which he wrote in 1946. I quote, "The voice of the church should be heard loud over the thunderstorm, and the artist should be her mouthpiece, as of old." Next slide. So murals at Collier's Wood Methodist Chapel and St Wilfrid's Brighton paved the way for further murals from churches in Holborn, Goring-on-Sea and Coventry, to Battersea, Bexley Heath and Shooters Hill. And this is just a map of the churches that are in the centre of London that then go to the southeast, which is the area I'm going to be talking about today. But there were murals in other parts of London, such as Harrow and Dagenham, and civic spaces at Dudley and Newport, and even in private homes from London to Bosham in Sussex to Bath. Slide. As we're here in St John's, Waterloo, though, let us start with this church. We've just walked through this 19th century classicising front, but we're also in a church that had architectural modifications added to it by Thomas Ford after the war. And we are looking on the screen, Yuka, and in front of us in the flesh at the two works he did for this church. I'm probably in the way, but at the bottom we've got the Adoration of the Christ Child. It is quite unusual for Feibusch to paint an image from Christ's infancy. It is more common for him to paint images of the crucifixion, as we see above. Next slide, Yuka. But also images of the resurrection of Christ and the ascension of Christ. So let us consider first the way in which Feibusch expresses pain and raw emotion at what is being witnessed. You can see here at the crucifixion these open mouths that I've been talking about, the way in which he uses arms and hands pushing in to the scene to express grief. Note too the two figures here. This is probably St John the Evangelist with his open mouth, who's also trying to protect Mary from swooning as she probably falls to the ground with her grief. Feibusch does not hold back with emotion, and compared to many precedent images of the crucifixion, he doesn't seem afraid to express what must have been a time of great fear and foreboding for Christ's apostles and other witnesses at the crucifixion. Let us look as well at what he does with the brush. You'll see these very, very broad strokes of paint. They look almost rough. Look at this almost abstract, quite zany background there with the paint. The paint breathes expression. It almost borders on being abstract. And that, I think, also enhances the magnitude of the despair and feeling of loss at Christ's death. Slide. It is this that I thought was important to consider with Feibusch's work. This way of showing vulnerability, while also exposing an artist with refugee status himself, fleeing cruel, ill-judged authority, just as Christ was when his parents had to take him as a baby into Egypt, away from Herod's impending massacres. So there are a lot of ironies out of ironies and vanity out of vanities with Feibusch's work. Next slide, please. So to the next church, which is church right by the River Thames, Holy Trinity, Rotherhithe. This is another Thomas Ford church that was built from 1960. Next slide. Here we can see how the artist experiments with iconography and background settings, and I'm drawing your attention to the background setting here. Here we almost have a 2-for-1. We have a crucifixion with also the Holy Trinity, or Christ in glory. The vicar told me that he remembers parishioners who remember watching Feibusch paint, and they referred to him as a quiet and affable man. And note the witnesses here. For example, these two figures standing here, who, he told me, may have been portraits of local dockers. Next slide, please. This is some detail of that background. It's a sort of architectural hodgepodge. You can see a dome here, a classical temple front here, a tower here, and 2 more slides to come. Next slide. So now to an example of a post-war church, the one I spoke about at the beginning, the main architectural mission for which was to get a church space built as quickly as possible. And working closely with Ford, it seems that Feibusch understood how to combine a narrative mural with light and a cool, limpid architectural language. You'll see here the windows that let in a lot of light. Next slide, please. Here we might consider the focus on the human body. Some of them are kneeling with their backs to the viewer. Some are standing with their arms pushed out. Lots of different gestures. I know you can't see very well here. Here in the middle, right below Christ, at the Ascension, are 2 angels, and it looks as though they are just walking up onto the ground on which the apostles and witnesses are beholding Christ. It's interesting how Feibusch paints the angels with the mortals here. There are faces shielding as if they can't cope with what they're seeing. There's a huge range of bodily expression and facial expression here. This is what I mean about Feibusch's iconographical boldness. Next slide, please. So we go now to St Mary the Virgin Welling, another Thomas Ford brick-built church. Another example of a church built very quickly to give people in establishing suburban areas of London places to worship. Next slide. And here again we see how he explores the witness to the sense of majesty of Christ in the Ascension. Here, though, you'll note that there are 4 protagonists in this detail here who are kneeling. Conversely, you see Mary here in her vivid blue, who's actually looking out more to the viewer, which the other figures are not. Next slide. This is St James's Merton, and I'm choosing this because if we go to the next slide, we have a letter that Feibusch wrote in 1975 after he went back to the church for the mural that he designed earlier and gave the church instructions on how to look after the mural. I'll just quote a little bit from the end of the letter. He says, "The surface is not to be rubbed hard, but rather stroked with the brush, sponge, and then left to dry. Each picture to be washed in one go, from the top down, because breaks would leave demarcation lines." He says each picture, if we go to the next slide, that's because in this church there are 3 murals. This is the central one of the resurrection. On the left we have the Noli Me Tangere, and on the right the road to Emmaus. Just one little iconographical detail. Christ coming out of the tomb, looks as though he has his eyes closed. Look at the 2 soldiers, according to Matthew's Gospel, the watchful soldiers. Not a bit of it here, they're fast asleep. Next slide. Sadly, though, some of Feibusch's mural art is also undercover, in places where the mural has been removed from its original church location or bricked up. Another poignant consideration, given his potential plight if he had stayed in Germany. This is All Hallows, Southwark. The roof is off. Next slide, please. I haven't taken an axe to discover the truth, but apparently behind this wall, and if we go to the next slide, there is this, the Noli Me Tangere, which used to be the altarpiece of the church, but it is now completely concealed. I think the mural is not saying, don't touch me, or maybe it is, but anyway, it would be nice if we did touch it, actually. And then the next slide. And another tragedy, really, with many ironies, the Church of St. Ethelburga in Bishopsgate, destroyed in an IRA bomb in 1993. You can just here make out, amidst all the destruction, the colour, the vibrant colour of Feibusch's crucifixion, which was there. This is what it looks like in an old photograph, and apparently it has also been bricked up, but ironically, when the church was restored. So, the tale of Feibusch's church is very turbulent. Next slide. This is just a map of the churches in Sussex, because I want to just talk about what has happened to this mural at St Elizabeth's in Eastbourne. This church, next slide please, has also, as you can see, suffered destruction. The mural that Feibusch painted here, next slide please, the Pilgrim's Progress, a very large work going around 3 walls of the crypt, has been saved, but as yet, as far as I know, somebody may have more up-to-date material than me, its fate is not completely certain yet. So, to conclude, next slide. And I'll take you back to this montage because I think this gives you the best idea of some of the themes that I've been drawing on. The human body, some of the apostles looking like they're training for the marathon, full of vigour, the colour, vivid colour, and of course the expressions. So Feibusch's artistic power is the heat of colour, coupled with the heat of passion and pain. We can see that he painted human nature, physiognomy and vulnerability with consummate vigour and audacity. For this alone, his art is worth saving. And there is an intense freedom in the way he paints the Christian subject, unleashing the place of personal response and the witness to Christ's suffering. We are also lucky to have his mural art in the UK. If he had not been living in Germany in the 1930s at such a turbulent time, is it likely that he would have stayed there and continued to work in Germany? And these church walls in Britain would remain there. While some murals are still visible and accessible, as you have seen, some are in poor condition or hidden to view, and all need to be revealed to a wider audience. Feibusch's mural painting legacy is at risk. But one of the most vivid images for me is to think of Feibusch getting the main gig and space to paint at high altar, cupola, and even on ceilings in churches, in a brutal, bombed and devastated world. It is not as though he could pop into the next room like Raphael or Michelangelo could do in the Vatican to see what others were doing, to get ideas. No, he was really surrounded by dereliction when he was painting these murals. And so he was driven by his own artistic sense and presumably a really strong imagination for how medieval church murals had looked, but also his memory of Italian fresco painting. So if you can imagine, with that colour and with that pain, what a breath of fresh air his art must have been in 1950s Britain. So, just to end, I sincerely hope that you will all get on a red bus and go to see a Feibusch film. Thank you.